All right, so I'm Jody Thomas. I'm one of the co-organizers. We've got Alex Shao on. Jim Lane, who many of you know, is not able to join us this evening, but sends his regards. We are recording this, so if you guys want to share it afterwards, it'll probably be up in about a week or so on our YouTube channel. It's NoVA UX, so you can find us on there. If this is your first time joining NoVA UX, please, say hello. Let us know where you're from in the chat. We're so glad that you could join us this evening. Also, if your company is hiring, feel free to put that information in our chat. We do our best to try and pull those out after the event and post them on our meetup page. So if there's anything about the role, your company, or if you can actually just pop a link in there, that's super, super helpful. Definitely always want to make sure we're making connections throughout, the community that we have. Also, if you're interested in speaking at one of our future events, please reach out to myself, Alex, Jim. We definitely love to have you and feature your talk in one of our future meetups. So a couple of housekeeping things. I think, Roxana, you were okay taking questions in the middle of the talk. So would you rather have folks unmute themselves or just post it in the chat and Alex can alert you?
Let's have folks unmute themselves. I have faith in humanity.
Perfect. Sounds good. We will also do some questions at the end. So if something comes up towards the end, we'll definitely carve out some time there. Next month's event, we haven't posted it yet, but we're getting really close. We're just working out a couple of details. Nathan Curtis is going to do a workshop on design system contributions. So I do want to let everybody know it's going to be a hands-on workshop, even though it's virtual. And so the attendance is going to be a little bit smaller. We are going to cap it at about 50 people just to kind of keep it a little bit more manageable, since we're all going to be in probably a mural working through some things. So hopefully that'll be posted in the next couple of days. Right now we are targeting November 16th. All right, so this evening's event, tonight we are thrilled to be joined by Roxana-Maria Barbu. She is a senior cognitive and behavioral experience researcher. So she focuses, her passion is human cognition, behavioral science, and advanced statistics. She works for Macadamian, which is a healthcare technology company. And so I am just thrilled to have her walk us through some of the findings and approaches to designing for behavior change, which I think all of us have aspects of that in our day-to-day. So Roxana, I'd just love to sort of let you take it away.
Thank you so much, Jody and Alex. Thank you for the invitation and for the kind welcome. So like you said, behavior change is neither new nor a foreign concept to any of us. We all experience change all the time. Like this week, I packed away my summer shoes, pulled out my rubber boots. This morning, I added a new vitamin to my collection of morning vitamins. So change is inevitable. And most of these daily changes, we don't even think of them. They don't require a digital solution or anything like that. We don't think twice about swapping our wardrobe when the season changes. But other changes when it comes to building new habits, starting a new medication, even adopting a new platform at work as we switch to remote, switching to remote successfully, these kinds of changes are not straightforward. And that's where designing for behavior change comes into play. So that's what I want to talk to you about today, kind of some of these must-haves that a digital solution needs to have, really, to help people achieve meaningful behavior change. So I do see quite a few familiar faces in the audience. I'm grateful for that. If someone comes twice, I guess it's a good sign. But there's also a few new names. So I'll tell you a bit more about myself. Like Jody said, I work at Macadamian Technologies, which is a consultancy where we co-create digital solutions. mostly in the wellness and health space. But as you all know, healthcare is usually a little bit behind the curve. So to make sure we stay ahead of the curve, we take projects from other fields as well, whether it's cybersecurity, food industry, and so on, to kind of always be ahead of the healthcare game. And my official title, that's why I was giggling earlier when you said it, it is Behavior and Cognitive Experience Researcher. Even for me, it's a mouthful, but it's a really good reflection of the way I approach my work. So on one hand, there's this behavior layer, the traditional UX methods we're all familiar with and we apply day to day, whether it's interviews, ethnographic research, usability sessions, all of these come into play in the behavior layer. But the problem with these methods is that these methods alone don't give us full visibility into cognitive processes. So that's where the cognitive part comes in. I have a PhD in cognitive science, and we all know that as humans, a lot of our decision-making process is unconscious, right? It's driven by subconscious aspects that we have little to no visibility into. So an easy study, there's a study a while back, is like 5 pairs of socks in front of a store and people had to pick which one is their favorite. And they picked, I think it was the left side pair, and came up with all these ridiculous explanations as to why. But really, it was just a position bias because the pairs were rotated all throughout and the position always won depending on, the position won regardless of what pair was in there, and there was no difference between the pairs anyway. So these kinds of things that happen in the background, that's where the cognitive part comes in. So what I like doing in my role at Macadamian is bridging traditional UX with cognitive science and neuroscience insights and approaches. And that's my happy place. So what are we going to talk about today? I want to share with you some of the things that I think they're kind of key to keep in mind as we work on products and solutions intended to lead to behavior change. So we'll talk about the psychology of habit formation. We'll talk about barriers, which are often forgotten. And then this idea of product person journey. And the bulk of the talk, I'll go over 13 behavior change principles, which hopefully sound as intuitive to you as they are to me. And really the trick is how we go about using these principles to create a new solution intended to change behavior successfully. So let's talk a bit about habit formation. The easiest model out there is the 3R model, which is really, it's famous, so I'm sure all of you have heard of it. And it's beautiful in its simplicity as a framework of behavior change. Reminder, routine, reward. That's it. Reminder, we all know what it means. It's that never-ending alarm that tells you what to do. Or maybe it's the nagging voice of your husband or partner or someone who tells you something time and time again. Routine is what happens if we listen to the reminder, if we follow through successfully. And the reward, that's the happy time, right? Whether it's material, you're on a diet, it's the slice of cake on your cheat day, or it could be something more tangible, less tangible, like improve quality of life, improve self-esteem, or days won back if you're trying to quit smoking. So it could really be a spectrum of rewards. And really, it's pretty straightforward, but well, it seems pretty straightforward, because if it were this easy, we'd all be the best version of ourselves. And I don't know about you, but I'm not, because if I were, I'd drink more water than coffee, but I drink more coffee than water. So I like doing this poll, and I like doing this poll across the world. How long do you guys think it takes to form a new habit? 5 days, 21 days, or 66 days? Okay, so I see lots of people voting. Very good. Drew's comment, definitely depends on the habit. So I'm going to stop it now. Do you guys see the results or only me? Okay. So by overwhelming majority, the answer is, oh, let's see, it's 21 days, which, oh, how did I get rid of this? There we go. Okay, so your answer was 21 days. In reality, it's actually 66 days. That's how long it really takes. But what really matters is not even the average. What really matters is the time, as you already hinted, some of you hinted in the chat, depending on the habit. What matters is the variability. It can take as little as 18 days, and it can take up to 254 days. So this variability has to do with differences between people, and also differences in the habit or behavior we're trying to form or change. So just this already hints to the fact that behavior change is really, really complex, and it requires a high degree of personalization. And one of the reasons why this 3R model doesn't quite work in reality as well as it does on paper is because of the barriers that get in our way. And oftentimes people forget to explore these barriers, and they design for ideal case scenarios. And that's, of course, a problem. So this is an example of barriers that we identified creating a solution for people to manage their diabetes. It was a recent study done during COVID, but as you can see, many of these are transferable. So things like anxiety, financial instability, you can see these apply across projects, across situations really, really well. But there is one that I wanted to highlight, which is really overlooked, and we'll come back to this one later, which is having extrinsic motivation. So I don't know about you, but many of the talks I've attended and even the books and resources that I'm reading, people in the field always talk about how great intrinsic motivation is. So intrinsic motivation is the one that's like super personal to us. It's coming from within. It's really, really powerful. And how this intrinsic motivation helps with forming a new habit. However, the reality is that more often than not, at least in a field like healthcare, you don't have a choice. People get diagnosed with something, and then they need to start the treatment then and there. They barely have time to understand their diagnosis. They barely have time to, deal with it. But definitely no time to develop intrinsic motivation. And not starting the treatment right away could have severe life-ending consequences. So everyone talks about designing for intrinsic motivation or takes it for granted, but it's like having that motivation is many times the exception rather than the norm. So depending on your field, that's something I would caution to really keep in mind because it's very overlooked. So something else I want to share with you is we all know this common technique of journey mapping in UX, but I like to take it a step back before that and remember that whatever we're designing, whether it's an app, any kind of digital solution, there's a common path, there's a common journey between the person and the product. And different things have to happen at different times, but we need to think of it as a shared journey. And oftentimes when we do journey mapping, we do it from the user perspective. We don't actually map it with the phases in the product itself. We kind of ignore that part. So I like to think of this in a very straightforward, easy way, almost like the phases of a relationship. And just like in our day-to-day experiences, this is obviously not meant to be prescriptive in any way. Some phases are reversed, some are skipped altogether, depending on the solution and the project. But generally speaking, I'd say there's a first date, there's a first interaction with someone, right? Which may or may not lead to a second, third, fourth, so on, which I call the honeymoon period, because you're on your best behavior trying to impress. And if that goes well, then there's some form of long-lasting partnership, be it marriage, whatever it is, colleagues for roommates for life, whatever. But there is something that lasts for a really long time. And in some cases, it lasts forever till death do us apart, and sometimes it doesn't. So what does that mean from a solution perspective? Well, during the first date or pre-onboarding, that's when a prospective client just gets a first glimpse of the solution. So it could be scrolling through the App Store, it could be through a referral, a billboard, whatever that first exposure may be. And one, that exposure needs to happen. And two, it has to be positive enough that they give it a second try after that initial exposure. So if you see an app with the worst review in the world, or 1 out of 5 or whatever, you're not going to go digging more to see if you agree with the negative review. You probably will sort by reviews to start with and only look at the ones with high reviews. So depending on how this pre-onboarding goes, someone may or may not make it to the onboarding, where the goal is to really persuade the person that whatever that solution is, there's value in it for me. So the faster I can see that value, minimizing time to value, the better, the more successful the onboarding is. So this is really tricky, right? Because only if these pre-onboarding and onboarding are successful, a person actually makes it to the daily usage, to exploring all those functionalities and content where most teams spend all of their time. But regardless of how great and useful those functionalities may be, if the person doesn't engage with the solution past the first 2 stages, they'll never get to experience the cool features, right? So, and I've done another poll, asking where teams should spend most of their time. And the answer has very often been daily usage. The problem with that is you're making users happy, but only the users that make it that far. And now I'd like us to dive into 13 behavior change principles. And the beauty of these principles, I hope to you as well, is that they're clear and intuitive. Like we all have an idea that trust, credibility, transparency, motivation, all of these things, they're meaningful, and we have an idea of what they mean, right? But the trick is to actively consider each and every principle, and even create your own depending on your field, and translating them into design at the right stages. Because just looking at this, it's easy to say, of course, reminders are important. But how do you create a good reminder? If you've snoozed your alarm at least once, then you know it's not easy. So let's go through a few examples. Trust, credibility, and transparency. I feel like every talk I attend and every conversation I have across fields, everything surrounds it, like everything is centered around this. And I think this one's the most complex one in the sense that there's like 3 levels to it at least, right? So trust, people should be able to trust their whatever digital solution to share their data with. Like if you've ever downloaded a health or wellness app, they ask for so much personal information. And oftentimes they ask for it for a good reason. But it's important for us to understand how sharing that information benefits us. right? Like it has to be clear to us, why should I share all of this? And then the transparency part is not just why am I sharing, it's also being clear and transparent about everything that is being done with my data. Are you only using it to personalize my experience, or are you using it to retrain whatever algorithm is behind the app or the recommendation system? Or I need to know these things. Are you sharing it with someone else? Right? So that openness about, one, what's the value? Why should I take the time to give you all of this personal information? And two, tell me what are you going to do with it, and should I trust you? The third layer is a bit different, credibility. It's not so much about us trusting the solution with our data. It's more about in a sea of applications. Let's say if we think of nutrition apps, there's hundreds, if not thousands, of nutrition apps on your app store. So how do you know? How do you pick one out of those thousands? So credibility is that piece of information that the app gives you back to convince you that I should trust you out of these thousands. So how does the app persuade me that that's the one? So it's the reverse, right? It's about the content of the app. Why do we trust it? So I'll give you, just for time's sake, I'll give you one example for credibility. So Headspace is a meditation app, and a very straightforward way how it instills credibility into users is by highlighting its scientific rooted approach. So it talks about, the team, publications, years of experience, things like that. And very many apps do this. It's just one of the ways you can say, I am the expert, and this is why you should pick me. Motivation. So we talked earlier during the barriers about how a person's motivation matters. And one of the first things that any product or solution needs to do is to figure out whether the person has intrinsic or extrinsic motivation. Because we often assume intrinsic motivation, but in reality, depending on the type of motivation, the app needs to adopt different engagement mechanisms. Motivational quotes or things like that, or a picture of, the mountain I want to climb, may work out if I have intrinsic motivation. But it won't necessarily work if my doctor told me you need to lose X kilograms in the next 2 months, otherwise these are the risks, right? I'll need something else if that's the case. Maybe a financial reward, or maybe a more, like, I don't want to say scary, like the opposite of motivational, but that's a technique too, right? Like understanding the risks, like punishment. So really, depending on the type of motivation, different engagement mechanisms will work. And if you don't determine it first, then you'll provide the wrong ones. One example I really like is Noom, which is an app that helps people with eating habits. So what it does is it asks people, what is their super goal? So maybe it's something like running 5K. But then it does exactly what we do in an interview, like the why laddering technique, right? So it keeps asking why until the person reveals their ultimate goal, which could be something like feeling better in their own skin, improving their self-esteem. And that's a bit different, right? So capturing that one allows it to revisit it throughout and tap into that intrinsic motivation, assuming the person has it in the first place. I think individualization or personalization is one of the key words of the year. We always talk about, tailoring solutions, understanding personas and tailoring solutions to personas. But I think really in today's society, there's an increased expectation that personalization happens at the person level rather than at the persona level, if that makes sense. That's why I'm a big fan of the word individualization as opposed to personalization. And that is increasingly possible as UX and AI come together. But that's a topic for another talk, combining the two approaches for a high degree of personalization. But really, solutions should account for people's different starting points. Where are you in your journey? What are your motivations? What are your needs? What are your preferences? And some of these are easier to capture than others, but they're all important. One of my favorite examples is this balance meditation app. It asks people where they are in their journey, and it's very straightforward, but then it tailors the tasks and exercises based on the starting point. So if you're anything like me and you're not a runner and you engage in an app, if the first goal is 5 kilometers, like, well, let me just walk 5 first. Then it could be it's definitely not ideal, and you may give up too fast for the wrong reasons. So the starting point is really, really important. Part of that too is the education component, right? So education is always crucial. We're more likely to engage in any activity and follow through with it if we understand what we're doing and how it benefits us and how it ties into that ultimate goal, right? And it sounds common sense, but so many apps are missing this point. So I've seen epilepsy apps that have goals related to hydration, and then people it's like, okay, well, I drink water, but what does that have to do with my epilepsy? Well, it has to do with, the size or duration or something with your aura, and like, it has implications, but they're not common sense to us. They're not public knowledge that someone with a new diagnosis just wakes up knowing. Or with diabetes, I've seen goals related to sleep. And I've actually had people laugh. It's like, well, if I sleep more, then chances are I'm not burning off any sugar. When in reality, a proper sleep routine has a lot to do and a huge impact on managing your sugar levels, right? But you need to teach that. Otherwise, you can ignore goals because you just don't see how they tie into your ultimate one. So I think this education component is key. I really like my MyFitnessPal for this one, which has to do with diet and exercise. And when it has these educational snippets about food entries, like the orange tells you using olive oil, you're too close to your maximum amount of fat, whereas eating something else, it's good. And just that simple, straightforward, intuitive way of distinguishing really stays with you. When you look at the menu, it's I found myself just saying things like, oh, can I have the dressing on the side? Because I know last time I saw what olive oil will do to me. Or there's 2 choices. I'm just gonna go for salmon this time. So it's really, it's a very easy takeaway message that sticks with you. Goal setting and revising is, and you guys hinted to this in the chat earlier when someone mentioned tiny habits, is a very successful behavior cognitive technique. And the idea of tiny habits itself, so breaking down the path to the ultimate goal into small, feasible, and easy to track snippets is crucial. But on top of that, so these goals need to be there to guide the person as milestones, but they also need to be reasonable. Something I've seen this in diabetes, in apps to help people manage their diabetes. Eat half a banana. Okay, well, if I'm at home, sure, I found a way. I'll put the other half in the freezer and eventually make a banana bread. But if I want to take that for my lunch, what am I going to do? Cut my banana in half, take half a banana? Like, who does that? Or some of these measurings, like 2 tablespoons, well, if I'm in a restaurant or I'm in a regular place, like what am I gonna like pull up and measure a few milliliters of something? Like, they have to be reasonable, because otherwise we won't do it. And one of my favorite examples is from this quitting, like a smoking cessation app. And what I really like about it is not only that it has tons of goals that different people can identify with, but it also tracks things like days quit, dollar saved, cigarettes avoided. And what I really like about this is that these goals, some of them, they tie into intrinsic motivation, whereas others tie into extrinsic motivation. So we all know smoking can be quite an expensive hobby. So money saved can be a huge incentive there. So that's an extrinsic motivation, right? But if money's not a factor, then tracking time won back really speaks to someone's intrinsic motivation. So this is one of the very few apps I found that really provides goals towards the 2 kinds of motivations. And of course, it's needless to say that setting goals and feedback go hand in hand. If you have a goal, you also need to understand your progress towards it and how to get better. You need to know where you're heading, and you need to know what to do, how to act on that feedback. And it's always important to remind people how that feedback and how that goal relate to the ultimate outcome. And I thought this Garmin one is really interesting. It has an interesting way of providing feedback because it adds this lens of social comparison. Of course, it's not always appropriate. I wouldn't do this in, let's say for an app for multiple sclerosis, where the path of advancing in your symptoms is not something you can control. So clearly it's not always appropriate. But there are cases where social comparison can be really powerful. So it can be motivating, but it also creates a sense of community and belonging. So on one hand, it's telling you, this is how you're doing relative to these people, which can be encouraging or motivating, or, if you're a competitive person. But it also tells you you're not alone. There's so many others engaged in the same activity. So I think this is a very clever way of giving feedback. And we talked about reminders. We all know they're a must, right? You can't achieve repetition without reminders, but the trick is making them work. So like we said, if you snooze your alarm at least once, having just a plain boring alarm is not enough. So I personally am a big fan of behavior change, even when you use a digital solution, of behavior, like the techniques used in the app extending outside of the app. And I think one way to do that is with reminders. So one of my favorite examples is from Fabulous, which is an app that helps people build new habits. And what it does is it advises you to put sticky notes all throughout your house. So like I confessed at the beginning, I'm not very good at drinking water. I drink more coffee than water. My sticky notes are pretty much everywhere, on my fridge, on my monitor screen, by my bed, and they're a physical reminder that I need to do something about it. And no one knows what it's for. It's just a symbol that I picked, right? I know what it stands for, but if I have people over, they don't know it means I'm going to drink more water, or for my little brother that he has to brush his teeth, right? He doesn't want our guests to know that. But it helps him, it helps me for different reasons. And it's in our environment. And I see a question. Linking existing routines as a reminder for new tiny habits, stacking habits. I think stacking habits is a very, very useful technique. And very recently, actually, I assessed in multiple sclerosis app. And one of the things that you have to start taking right away is vitamin D when you're diagnosed. Well, we should all take it before, not that I'm in a position to advertise that, but so they say. Don't take me at my word. But yeah, so associating an existing habit, a new habit with an existing one, then it's half of the challenge, because it's just part of the behavior is the repetition. So if you already have that repetition built in, putting two pills next to each other is a lot easier than inventing a new time and learning a new, completely new behavior from the get-go. I do think there's limitations to it. It's just, you know, the idea of stacking habits, it works a lot easier if you know you have a cup of tea at 8 a.m. breakfast and you add a vitamin to it. But just because you have a routine at 8 a.m., that doesn't mean you're going to add a 5-kilometer run as easily, right? So there's limitations there, but I think that's where the starting with tiny habits first and then building up the entire habit and creating the new one helps as well. My pleasure. Engagement mechanisms. So of course, our goal oftentimes is adoption and retention, and we use all kinds of engagement mechanisms for this. But what we've been saying all along is that these mechanisms need to consider the person's motivation, and really they need to be rooted in the psychology of habit formation and consistent with cognitive neuroscience findings. So what do I mean by that? Oftentimes, even when I read like journal articles on evaluations of apps, they're like, oh, this app used rewards, check mark, as if it's a positive. But just having rewards in an app alone is not necessarily a positive thing. Like there's a full science behind rewards. You can have a course or heck, a full degree just in rewards, right? You can have a PhD thesis and rewards. And so it's not about having the reward, it's understanding that what really leads to dopamine release is the anticipation of the reward. And you're not going to have anticipation if you can fully predict it. So then it's about the predictability or lack of it of a reward. It's about how proportional it is to the task at hand and so on, right? So too often these engagement mechanisms are used as a check mark, but it goes far deeper than that. So a very interesting one is this journaling technique, which is a very effective cognitive behavior technique. And I see it in lots and lots of apps, but LifeWorks actually goes ahead and explains to people why writing in this journal is beneficial to them. So the technique is there. It also combines it with that educational component that we talked about earlier. And that's a plus, right? Whereas in others, you would just see it as a note typing spot with absolutely any explanation Why should you do it? How is it going to benefit you? Is anyone even analyzing those responses? And sometimes they are. There's sentiment analysis done in the background and there's value to it. But to me, it just looks like a note-taking spot. And if I have no visibility into one, how it benefits me, two, what are you doing with that data, I have no reason to engage with that functionality. So just because the functionality is there, it's not enough. Aesthetic experience, this was one of my favorite because sometimes people really focus on it and forget about usability and designing for behavior change overall. And other times they completely forget about it. So it's an interesting extreme here. But really, this has to do with so much, from choice of colors, the meaning of the colors, so think psychology of colors, imagery, tone, all of these should be aligned, not just with the brand, but also with the intent of the app. And if we're speaking from a global perspective, it has to be appropriate to the subject matter at hand and cultural sensitivities. So you can't just pick one, have a small group of users, and then expand globally and expect it to work. Or even translations, when it comes to tone, it's not about translations, it's about linguistic translations, which take into account those cultural sensitivities. So something as easy as saying, we're translating the app into this language. Well, you need to hire a linguistic or one with anthropology or sociology and linguistics and abilities to translate, not a straightforward translator, because then all these contextual sensitivities will end up in big no-nos. I really like this one, and it's often advertised, My Sugar, a diabetes management app. It's pretty successful, and what it does is it uses humor to kind of make content stick, and it has this little monster which jumps around and laughs, and lots of people love it. But even anecdotally in my family, one of my parents adores it, whereas the other one's reaction was like, "But do you think I'm in kindergarten? Is this for your brother or for me?" So it's something like this. It requires personalization. Like, there has to be a way to turn this off. Not everyone wants this, though it's really successful with a big group of people. The human connection one, it's interesting because it satisfies this universal need that we all have, but it can also very often be misled in the sense that people think that human connection means literally connecting with people, which it doesn't. Not all of us want to, not all of us have our camera on, not all of us want to unmute and talk to each other, right? Some just want to be part of this community without having to say a word out loud and just absorb information and know that they're part of this group. And I think that's where many solutions miss the mark. They very often either provide a chat or they provide some form of peer-to-peer interaction or ability to connect with someone, but it isn't, you don't always see the distinction between direct connection and indirect one, just like we saw with the social comparison, or the ability to read about other people, learn, see that they're there, know you're part of the community without ever having to actually digitally interact with them. Because sometimes that's all you need, is just to know you're not alone, but you don't want the added pressure of interacting directly. And another risk with the human connection one is when apps do have these stories that are shared. So I've seen it very often in Facebook groups, let's say for multiple sclerosis. There's different types of multiple sclerosis. There's relapsing remitting, there's progressive. And the symptoms and how fast something declines really differs. And, you know, people will be like, I'm 2 years in and I've just excelled at this exercise. Whereas someone from a different stream with a slightly different diagnosis will never be able to do that just because of the course of the condition. So that's an example of social comparison gone wrong, basically. So those are things to be aware of when there's too much exposure or too much freedom of content within human connection. One interesting example is also from Fabulous. There's a lot of studies showing that if we make a commitment, you know, we're more likely to follow through. But just like with everything else, not all of us are willing to make that commitment publicly to a partner or on social media or, you know, some of the recommendations that you see out there. So what Fabulous does, it allows you to do this promise in the app itself. And it's kind of your secret with the app without the added pressure that I've posted on LinkedIn or Facebook. So it's a middle point, kind of speaking to that indirect aspect of human connection. And we're approaching the end. The relevance, the 11th one is the relevance, which basically says that everything has to be relevant and appropriate to the user's needs. So it has to be timely, it has to be the right amount of details, and always conducive towards the user's outcome. So it's really tied into that education component, right? Understanding how it relates to the outcome and getting rid of everything else that just adds cognitive overload, and having the information at the right time, which also ties back to the personalization. I need to know where you are in your journey. I need to know how you progress towards a goal to be able to give you only the information that you need, sufficient and necessary for you to move forward without being overwhelmed. So the example I picked is from Mindshift, which is an app created to provide tools based on cognitive behavior therapy for young adults with anxiety. So it has all these guided exercises and plans for coping with anxiety. And it allows people to test things. So it uses things like belief experiments and test out beliefs that fuels one anxiety and sort of prove that, you know, it'll work out. So it serves as a coping mechanism. So you can send out an email that isn't perfect if you're terrified about making a grammar mistake. Someone who, you know, identifies themselves as perfectionists when it comes to grammar. And then you test it out, and then it asks you to reflect through the experience. And it prepares you for when it actually happens, right? So that's a great example of relevance. And remember how at the beginning we talked about that fourth stage, the growth and beyond? I think this transcendence and empowerment one really speaks to that. So the app should have elements that keep the user engaged after accomplishing their primary goal, or it should inform them of what's next. So I want to make this distinction here. Like our goal is not to induce engagement or addiction for life. It's just once there is an end. So let's say I join an app because I want to monitor my diabetes or something else. After I've accomplished that goal, there's two paths. Either there's some form of offboarding, and if that happens, then I should understand there should be a transition period where I'm taught how to keep that and maintain those habits in the absence of the app. how to build that independence outside of the app. And the other part is, well, sometimes there is a good reason to continue that relationship, maybe not at the same frequency, but there may be a reason for the app and the person to remain in a relationship. But there isn't always a good reason. That's what I'm trying to say. So we shouldn't like go fishing for that reason. But sometimes there is a good one. So I like this Clue Plus, which is a period tracking app. And maybe, you know, people join it when they have irregular menstrual cycles and they want to monitor that and so on. But one thing that it does is that it uses the data to kind of feed it to researchers around the world because there is a lack of data in the field. So even if you've achieved your goal, graduated your PhD, and you're back to normal, for some people, it's still a good enough of a motivation to really follow through and do this in the name of science. Or another good example is I joined because I want to become a runner. And once I've made it, I'm no longer a user of the app. I can become a mentor or a contributor or anything that makes me feel good or keeps me engaged in that community that I connected with. So it taps into these bigger universal themes of happiness, I guess, that connect all of us. And the last one, which is one of my favorites, and I think very timely during COVID, is that any solution should account for the environment and look out for changes in the environment and respond to these changes. So really, I could speak for hours just on this slide alone. The idea is that health apps or any apps really don't exist in a silo. And there's this intricate relationship between the app, the person, and the environment. And oftentimes people focus on the app in one silo, the user on the other, and the environment is completely forgotten. So one example is, I've seen it again, going back to managing diabetes. A group of ladies in my building apartment were using an app to manage their diabetes, and the activity that they sign up for was aqua fitness in the building's gym a few times a week. And when COVID started, the pool closed, their main activity went out the window. In the summer, they did gardening, they started a walking tour, but that doesn't work quite well from November to March during Ottawa winters. And the app failed to acknowledge that, hey, your main activity is no longer possible. Here are some alternatives. So they were kind of stuck. Like even something as easy as check out these things on YouTube. Check out these exercises you can do in your living room. Nothing. There was no acknowledgement in the app that we're during COVID and the gym is closed or the swimming pool is closed. So their main reason or the main benefit they got from the app went out the window with no acknowledgement. On the other hand, other apps are great at acknowledging this. So Noom, the nutrition app we talked about, goes ahead and acknowledges this and provides additional support and really responded to the fact that we're going through a pandemic and it affects everything, including your eating habits. And I've seen similar acknowledgements in multiple sclerosis apps and many other apps, but some just fail to acknowledge for this. And it's not just a pandemic, is any physical app in a country that has seasons with extreme weather, right? Accounting for those changes, seasonal changes, or accounting for people with traveling schedules. eating habits are not equally easy to maintain in your kitchen or after a 14-hour flight at the first restaurant and then the next day you start work. So accounting for those things and understanding your environment can be huge. And just in time with our takeaways, well, the 3R model we started with is just the beginning. Behavior change is far too complex and habits are not formed in silos. So we need to consider those barriers. We need to consider the environment. And these behavior change heuristics or principles we talked about are a layer above usability. They don't replace usability. They're just some of the key elements to lead to behavior change. And I've added here a few resources that we can share after. And that is it. So let me know what questions you have, thoughts.
Thanks, Roxana. This is amazing. See a few celebrations and applause going on with emojis. Alex, did we have any other questions that were in the chat that we might not have seen?
And I think there were some comments, but I've definitely unmuted all and asked for folks to unmute and wanted to use it as an open forum, have a chance to chat with Roxanne and ask her questions.
Hey, you don't even have to turn your camera on, just talk to us.
Well, I might have a question. I'm Alex from Edmonton.
Hi, Alex.
Hello. So is there an area of cognitive psychology and cognitive science that you feel is especially useful to the topic? So is there something from your background that you found you were using a lot?
I think that's a great question. I think really understanding how habits are formed, whether it's the psychology of habit formation, neuroscience of it, I think that's huge. Like there's brain rewire. So people use even just the word habit, right? Like people use it interchangeably between repeating a behavior several times or what it's a true habit, automatic habit, where there's been a brain rewiring, a transition from that period where there's high cognitive load to the one where it becomes automatic. Like think of driving. At the beginning, you have to think of everything. It's pain. And then by the end, like we don't really think right now that I have to put my seatbelt on. I have to turn on the car. Like there's a lot of things that we do automatically. And there's a transition point there. So I think that whole area of habit formation is huge. And then really understanding rewards and those kinds of mechanisms within the reward system. I think that's also really important. Like we were saying, just using it as a check mark, it's not enough. So that's where insights from cognitive science and neuroscience can really make those techniques useful and powerful. Motivational psychology, like all of those really.
Okay, thank you. That makes a lot of sense to me.
I just have a comment, Roxana. I really love the slide where you started to showcase the phase of the relationship and some of the considerations. I don't know that I personally have sort of tried to compartmentalize those before. It's just really helpful to sort of see some of that thinking lined up to a potential journey that any of our companies across industries might be able to relate to.
Yeah, I find it, so we came up with it internally and I find it really straightforward and useful, and it really comes in handy too when you start thinking of, depending at what point, as a researcher, at what point you join in the project. Well, if I join from the beginning, then I really want to be in touch with the marketing team because they're going to do the pre-onboarding or the onboarding, and I want to know what they've learned so I can have that background before I jump into my user research. So I think it really comes into many flavors, how you apply it. And then the other part is you may have trust and transparency in the daily usage, but if at the beginning I don't understand why I'm filling out 5 pages of personal information, then I'm not going to pass the onboarding. So I've seen many apps fail there.
Absolutely. I know I worked on an app years ago that needed location, and a lot of folks just hit that deny button, and then the app wouldn't work because it was so imperative to have the user's location.
Yeah, exactly.
And
And I mean,
oh, go ahead.
oh, no, Tiziana is asking, yeah, we can definitely share slides. I think you guys are sending the recording after.
Yes, I was just typing that to somebody who had sent a message as well. It typically takes us a couple of days to maybe a week. It just all depends on our work schedules and how busy they keep us to get the recording up.
Hey, Roxana, Terry Walters here.
Yeah, hello.
Hello, hey, quick question for you. I have spent the last several years looking at medication adherence and different applications to address. What I've found is that even chronically ill patients whose life and true wellness depends on taking medicine often don't. And I'm just curious, I mean, it's a very broad and very specific question. I don't expect a succinct answer, but top of your head, what are some areas that we are going to have to look at to help this improve medication adherence across the board without getting into specifics, but just some perhaps general research thoughts or areas that we need to better focus on?
I think I'm really glad you brought that up because it's something I always go back to, and it's mind-blowing in the sense that what medication non-adherence was, what, 50% like 30 years ago, and it's not any better today. So
Yeah.
we're advertising all these health and wellness apps, but in reality, one of the most important things we deal with, which is medication adherence, hasn't gotten any better, which is why I've gotten into this work. And it's telling me it takes a lot more for an app to be successful. In health apps, one thing that I've seen that does help with medication adherence is having a care partner. So the apps that have the user, but also have a support person to serve as that external reminder or accountability. So I've seen it in epilepsy, I've seen it in diabetes. It's that element of reminder plus human connection plus accountability, where you have an external person kind of taking care of it, at least in the early stages, until you start forming that habit. That's the first thing that comes to mind. Habit stacking helps if the person, if the app goes ahead and identifies first, are you taking any vitamins? Do you have a behavior that you really do every single day that can be associated with that, whether it's like your daily tea or coffee or any of those? That one I think is an easy one, just people don't actually explicitly ask and tell you associated with it. Like, it's common sense to us, but it's someone may need to be taught to do that association. I guess those are the first two things that come to mind. But I agree with you, that's one of the biggest challenges we have to tackle. And the fact that we haven't is an indication that we need to do better.
Thank you.
My pleasure. Let's see, I see a big question. How do you address drop-off after habits are formed? Let's see. For example, a user who might experience burnout with a running app What remotivators have you seen to be effective? Interesting. So I would rather not get to the point that you experience a burnout. I think that's where those elements of identifying where someone is in their journey helps you personalize their training so that they don't get overwhelmed, or they start at the right amount of exercising. And then the feedback and the goals. So if you fail meeting your goals, or you report your emotions or feelings a few times and they're extreme, then those goals should be revisited. So I think a combination of identifying where the person is in their journey, so their starting point, along with tailoring those goals to where they're at, and really taking into account their feedback to revisit those goals, can avoid experiencing burnout to start with. So I can't think of any successful remotivators. That's the risk with failing first. I hope that helps, Sean. And my pleasure for providing the examples.
All right. Well, it seems like we're kind of winding down with questions. I want to definitely thank you, Roxana, for everything. Oh, it looks like we just got another question in, so maybe we'll take this as our last question. It looks like Tina has one.
Let's see, I love that you direct us to refer to the science behind habit formation. We know that some of this knowledge has been leveraged in the tech industry in nefarious ways. Do you have any thoughts on ethics? Yes. How many hours do we have at our disposal? Actually, I feel really strongly about that. And I think digital health and wellness apps are in a gray zone, because oftentimes they provide information that and advices that then collect data that really oftentimes you do in a clinical trial or hospital setting. But if they don't do the whole FDA approval and so on, they don't have to follow the same regulations, though they should. So one of the things that we do at Macadamian, like, we have our own internal ethics package. We've looked at ethics across all kinds of review boards. Depending on the product, we even get external IRB committees. I think it's really, really important to keep that in mind. It's huge from so many points of view, right? Like, it's the right thing to do for one. It's also, like, part of ethics is really delivery of information too. So things like as easy as the informed consent form. If you've ever done like a volunteering for a clinical trial or something like that, even in the hospital, they're so complex. The terminology, it's all legalese and medical and hard to grasp for anyone. So one of the things that we always do, the idea is that the official recommendations are for consent and forms and everything like that should be done at a grade 5 to grade 8 literacy level. So you really need to keep your population in mind and speak to everyone. So I don't really know where to go with this one, but I think having an internal ethics package and really following through with it is huge. And sometimes there's needs to even refer to an external IRB if you think there may be conflict or bias within the organization for whatever reason. Did that help? I can also share, let me see if I can find it fast enough. I wrote a post recent, not that recently, on ethics in product development.
I think you're right, Roxana, that could be a whole nother talk as well, especially in when it comes to medical and healthcare.
Yes. Let's see, I think I found it. So I'm gonna share this in the chat. Jennifer Fraser, our VP of UX, and myself wrote this a while back as we were revisiting our internal ethics process as well.
Nice. That's perfect. Thank you for sharing that.
My pleasure.
Well, and I definitely want to thank you for coming out tonight and for everyone who joined us. I know it's late. I know everybody's probably been glued to their computer since, 8, 9 o'clock this morning. So thank you again to Roxana and to all of our attendees this evening. I will send out a message when we get the recording up, so folks can watch that on YouTube. And I think, Roxana, you mentioned you may post your slides somewhere. I'm not sure. I think somebody asked that as
Yeah,
a
I'm happy
question.
to share the slides.
Great. And we'll also be posting our November meetup in a few days, so be on the lookout for that. Hope you all can join us. And thanks again to Roxana and to everybody who came out.
Thank you,
Appreciate it.
everyone.
All right.
In
Take care,
particular,
everyone.
thank you to Croatia at the